first day back to work after a 6-month maternity leave, and I am stoked. I cannot wait to get back to work. I'm drumming my fingers eagerly on the dining room table, waiting for our nanny Eliza to open the door. And the second she does, I hand her my 6-month-old baby, give that kid a kiss, and I run to the subway. I am so ready to be back. I get there and open up my email, and I start firing away to all the clients I've missed. And then I get the phone call. You moms know what the phone call is. Eliza is not feeling well. She thinks she has the flu, and she needs me or my husband to come home and relieve her. And I close my laptop, and a million thoughts start running through my head. The first one is, I read a post on Instagram about this. Some feminist mom blogger told me that this was going to happen, and I needed to be sure to call my husband at Midtown Manhattan Job to make sure that he knew that we were now 50-50 caregivers. And if I didn't tell him that I was no longer the primary caregiver, I was going to resent him for the rest of our marriage, and I may as well just get divorced now. That was thought number one. And thought number two was, I just took a 6-month maternity leave. In the United States of America, that is incredibly weird, even though it is totally normal everywhere else. But there was this fear here of like, my clients are not gonna wait for me one more day. But nonetheless, I packed up my stuff and I went home, and Eliza did in fact have the flu. And so for the next 4 days, I was home with my daughter Birdie, and I finished my first week back from maternity leave with a massive glass of red wine, about 45 minutes worth of work completed, and the voice of 17-year-old Callan in the back of my head saying, girl, I told you not to have kids. You knew something like this was gonna happen, and you are never gonna have the career that you wanted. That weekend, I had a little bit of a flashback. Celia was excited to be packing up her car with all of the amazing gifts that she had just received from friends and family. She and her husband, Martin, were gonna head back from Washington, D.C. to New York City, where they live, after this wonderful shower they've just had, when she starts to have these really deep and incredible pains in her stomach. And so she and Martin decide we better stop at the hospital before we go home. And it was there, 10 hours later, that she delivered their daughter, Molly, by emergency C-section. 29 weeks, 2 pounds, 7 ounces. And Molly would spend the next 3 months of her life getting strong in a hospital in a city that wasn't hers before she could go home to New York City. I was one of Martin's colleagues, and I was about 30 at the time, and I was newly married, and I still didn't want to have kids. I had worked really, really hard to get to where I'd gotten in my career. And I was running a team, and from time to time, when Martin and I worked together, it was a really big deal, big project. I was the kind of person, you know who it is, who like shows up at 8 a.m., eats lunch at her desk, works through dinner. That was me. And so this was the person Martin got to deal with. And I kind of felt like it was business as usual, because he and his manager decided that he would take a 1-week paternity leave, and then he would commute back and forth between Washington, D.C. and New York City until his daughter could come home. And so one day, maybe 3 weeks later, Martin sends me an email asking me to look over something before it goes out the door. And my God, y'all, it was a hot mess. I mean, forget the formatting being off and the numbers being wrong. I didn't even know what kind of story we were telling. And I had gotten advice from a mentor that said, whatever you do, never ever seed any sort of expectations with parents right after they come back from leave. You've got to keep it excellent, or else they'll start to think that the game has changed. And so I picked up the phone. Martin was on the train, because at this point in his life, Martin was always on the train. And I just gave him the feedback. And it was pretty direct, and it was pretty insensitive. And to Martin's credit, he let me know exactly how hurtful and harmful that was to him in that moment. 3 weeks later, our dear Martin quit. And I felt awful because I knew that I had something to do with it. But I did not feel as awful as I did the day, the week, or the weekend that I had tried to return to work from maternity leave. And I realized, man, work did not work for Martin. It did not work for me as a leader in that moment. And I'm starting to think it's not going to work for me as a mom or as a business owner. I've been doing work like this for a few years now. And I think that work actually isn't working for anybody. I mean, all of us have had a Martin moment, right? That moment where your life deserves to be at the center, and you put that work behind you, and then there's some sort of consequence. Work's not working for anyone for a few reasons. The first simply is our culture. In the United States of America, we love our superheroes, and we love the myth of the ideal worker. The guy, it's always a guy, who is always available for work, always says yes to the business trip, always available to his boss, always on. And in this country, we have conflated, since the beginning of our time, men with work and women with a home. So much so that in 2019, when women as CFOs and CEOs are kicking ass, 40% of Americans will tell you that mothers should not work outside of the home. Our second problem is that we can have the best policies and procedures in the world, and if we don't train our managers, it absolutely does not matter. Just last week, 2 studies came out that men were asking for parental leave, finally getting it, and not taking it. And when we asked them why, they said, "Do you really think my manager and my leadership support me in doing that? There is no way I will get promoted." And the third piece of this problem, and maybe y'all can relate, is that we are so process obsessed in our culture. There's really no reason why work needs to start at 9 unless you're a surgeon with a scheduled surgery or you have a shift that starts at that time. And for some reason, we are just obsessed with butts in chairs. And we all know this because we know it doesn't have to be so process obsessed and so centered there. So work has not been working for these reasons, and this has consequences, big ones. Work-related illnesses are now the 5th leading cause of death in the United States, worse than Alzheimer's. When people quit, companies are just like bleeding money because it's so expensive to replace them. And high-performing, highly qualified women are leaving their companies in droves at the moment they become working mothers. And 70% of them will tell you it is not because they wanted to. And companies are starting to ask themselves a question, could that have something to do with the fact that women are 50% of our new hires, but only 3% of our CEOs? About 100 years ago, some people said, you know what we should do? We should pilot a way of working and see if it works. Let's take the factory model and put it in an office building and see what happens. And hot tip, it didn't work. And so what do you do in business when things don't work? You innovate, you pilot, you move on, you move forward. And I really want to thank 2 women who planted this seed in my head 2 years ago, Haley Parker and Louise Dreyer, who said, what if we started to think about design thinking as a way to solve some of our really big problems? And here's what I mean. Okay, I'm buying a house right now, so I'm thinking all about furniture, so just roll with me, all right? So y'all know that Ames chair? It's by Herman Miller. It's this like delicious lounger that's like wood backed and it's got black leather or leather of your choice. And it looks like $1 million and it feels like butter when you sit in it. The reason why people love this chair is because the designer said, we are going to design for the outliers. We are going to design for a person who is 2'7" or 7'2", because designing for the average only gets us a small number of customers. What if we started to design for the outliers at work? What would it look like if we started to expand our thinking beyond who we think belongs in the workplace? Well, first of all, companies would go from being pretty process-obsessed to being people-focused, because they'd actually be dealing with people. We would go from being inflexible to being way more flexible in how we think about creating work. And yes, I mean, finally, can we all work from home? I mean, seriously, or from here? But also, flexible in the sense of like, why don't we innovate something like job sharing for our professionals like doctors and surgeons and teachers and lawyers who do have a lot of work that does start at 9 and still need some relief? We could design companies that have policies that work for the 27-year-old guy, no kids, no wife, no parents. No pets, I meant, but no parents, I don't know. He can do what he wants to do. But we could also design policies that work for the 55-year-old married man who has some aging parents and maybe an ailing wife and a couple of teenagers to corral. Maybe we will finally have a workplace where the people who work there are as diverse as the people we're designing products for and trying to sell to. And if we do this, companies will be incredibly successful. They will be richer, they will have more productive employees, their employees will be more satisfied, and their customers will love them more. And their employees will be healthier and happier, which has huge benefits for them personally and for their kids. This is quite possibly the future of work. And the question is, how do we actually get there? I, as a leader, have started to ask myself every day, and in as many moments as possible, how can I lead for the outliers? And then I think about three things. I think about my responsibility, I think about my resources, and I think about my risk. I have finally accepted as a leader the reality of my responsibility, which is if I don't do something to change the situation, I am responsible for it staying the same. That means that when I get an HR policy that doesn't include dads or adoptive parents in parental leave, I have a responsibility to say something to leadership. I've also learned as a leader that we adults really don't learn anything unless we learn it by doing. And so when we want to develop new skills, new mindsets, new leadership abilities to be people-centered, it will require that we get coaches and professional development and training so that we can try on these new skills, test it out in real life, come back and tell our coach what a big bomb it was, get them to pat us on the back, and go back into the game. That's the resource piece. And then the third piece is risk. If we believe that the way we've worked for more than 100 years isn't working, chances are someone's going to disagree with us. There are people who've given in, given up, or there are people who've really benefited from the way it works. And they're going to push back on us when we say, why don't we pilot this thing? Or can you please include men in this policy? And they're going to tell you your ideas are stupid. And you're going to have conversations with your direct reports that are really uncomfortable because you're actually talking to a human and not performing. And that's okay. Because the point of professional courage is not to be perfect, but to show up every day just a little bit better than you did the day before. This, to me, is the future of work that is already here. And what I mean by that is, those darn millennials are taking over. They're already like way more than 50% of the workforce, and by 2025, they're going to be 75% of the workforce. I can't even wait to see what happens. And this is a generation that looks at systems that don't work, and it asks why, and then it says, fix it. It's also a generation that likes to disrupt and innovate. And it's a generation that is starting to tell companies, I'm not going to give you my talent, and I'm not going to give you my money if you aren't people-centered and caring about sustainability and diversity. And that has huge implications for how we can actually push on the change of work. I also don't think that this has to take that long. It feels big and heavy, And trust me, the risk is high. If we do nothing and carry on business as usual, research has shown us it will take 200 years to get to gender equity. But it doesn't have to take that long to make these changes. I mean, look at me, you guys. 5 years ago, I was an asshole to Martin. I know that. And it sent me on a journey to understand, how can I lead better? Yes, as a manager, but really just as a human. How can I live for the outliers? And then how can I take responsibility and resources and risk and use them to change the game? And I obviously believe that this is possible because here I am, 24 weeks pregnant, having a boy, doing this whole rodeo all over again. Because I actually believe that we can change the game. And I think we can do it certainly in my career, but almost definitely, most definitely, by the time my daughter Birdie and this unnamed human are in work. So I invite you to consider with me, what would be possible if you started to live and lead for the outliers? And what would be possible if we actually designed work to work for everyone? Let's find out. Let's get to work. Thank you.